La 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 la. I still hate this. Take two. Okay, here comes another lo-fi explanation of a new essay that you've never heard of before that I'm going to over-explain to death. I'm going to pepper in some vocab terms, so you'll hear me use some of the key vocab for the next quiz, but don't think of this as the total vocab roundup. This will not be comprehensive. I'm just going to try to get your ear used to hearing the terms. I'll define a couple of them, so if you want to jot some notes down, you'll be getting some advance notice. But I'm going to release another video that goes through all the terms for the quiz with some examples and possibly quiz questions. So this is mostly about the essay, just getting yourself familiar with the next major assignment. Okay, so here it is. It's called the Historical and Philosophical Controversies Essay. I, like historians, am terrible at naming things. If you didn't know, the 100 Years' War was named by historians for being what? You guessed it, 116 years. So they should have a sexier title like the Matrix Essay or the Fight Club Essay. Essentially, I'm just trying to be as upfront as possible. Look, you know it and I know it. I over-explain everything. So let me try to give you the most simple, basic explanation of the essay possible before we get into the more complicated nuance and details and examples. Really, this is it. The entire essay is pick an argument that's been had by either historians or philosophers, an issue that there are two sides to where there's a disagreement among experts, present both sides, and then argue your side. So that's it. You're just trying to take something that either philosophers or historians have argued about. It's an ongoing disagreement. You learn enough about the topic to try to make a case as to which side of that disagreement is correct. So as always, it's usually a more complicated than that superficial level. So let me try to go into a little bit more detail. I would say this is not an official vocab term unless you're going to a four-year university. So if you're planning on going from ECC to something like a four-year university like Buff State, UB, you're going to SUNY Albany right after here to start your law degree, then you should write down the word historiography, because that's really what we're doing. The whole point of this essay is it's not about memorizing facts in a history book. You did that in high school, and some of you are really good at it. You're able to memorize things very cleverly and very well with good mnemonics. You're going to do great in your anatomy and physiology class if you're a good memorizer. But there's a lot of things that are not obviously facts. So if you say something like, yes, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, it rhymes, so it must be true. That's probably a fact. Enough experts agree. There's not an argument as to whether or not the year was 1492, it was Columbus, he was sent by Spain to try to discover a better trade route to India, and he bumped into the West Indies as a result of that. And of course, the discovery of America is attributed to him, but probably also Leif Erikson. The idea, though, that we have a date that you can memorize, we have a name that you can memorize, Columbus, so those are facts, and you can be pretty confident about those. What that leaves out is all the stuff that people argue about. Should you say that Leif Erikson discovered America? Can we even prove that? He's probably the first European that got to the continent of North America that we know of, but even that is up for some debate and for some controversy. So if you're going to a four-year school, write down the term historiography, because that's what we're doing. It's basically trying to see which sources you trust more, be intelligent about how you collect information. Is it a primary source or a secondary source? So if you're going to a four-year, it could be helpful. If not, just know that that's what we're doing, both with philosophy and with history. And if you're only planning to get the two-year, you're going to get out of here with your criminal justice major, be aware that that's what we're doing, looking at evidence and comparing it and making our own decisions. But you don't need to know the term for the quiz. So if you're going to a four-year, write it down. If not, don't worry about it for the quiz. All right, let me go through some of the basics here. I'm going to reformat this because my obsessive-compulsive disorder will overwhelm me. Okay, that's better. Everything's on one page, and I don't have to see it broken by line breaks that mean nothing because we're online and Word documents are meaningless now. So this is a longer basics list than the last essay, and let me try to make a case, an explanation as to why there's so many kind of itemized little rules and regulations here. Part of that is selfish. I'm deliberately giving you some compliance checks Did they read the direction, and did they remember to put their title in boldface type? Did they remember to add a title? Did they remember that it should be double spaced? So the reason that list is long is there's a lot of things where I'm kind of checking to see if you actually had the directions near you when you wrote the essay. But let me give that a positive spin, the exact same story with a positive narrative. If you follow these basics, you're very likely to pass. So that means I'm lowering the standards on some of the intellectual content and giving you a little bit more credit for kind of going through the motions, just making sure that you can follow this step by step. So most of these are self-explanatory. It's just that you have to remember to do them. A couple of the ones towards the end will need some explanation. So when it says at least two sources, one representing each side of the controversy, that just means at the very least you're going to have two sides and two sources that represent the point of view of each side. That could be a YouTube video, that could be an article that you found, that could be something including Wikipedia. I'll have a more in-depth conversation. We'll have the talk about Wikipedia when we get to the last third of the semester. But for now, Wikipedia is fine as long as you explain and you evaluate and justify. That's all I'm looking for. The reason that's in red is you can basically use anything as a source as long as you explain why it's there. So you're going to bring in a YouTube video. Here's some advance notice on the homework. If you got as far as homework 14, I believe it is, with Alan Watts, a little collection of philosophical observations, philosophical musings, you could totally use that as a source for your paper. So no preference for more serious or less serious sources, but you want to explain why you take them seriously. I looked up a little bit about Alan Watts, and it said that he was a pretty serious scholar of Eastern religions and Eastern metaphysics in America in the 1960s and 70s, and you're just explaining to me why you might like those YouTube videos as a serious source that you think helps deepen your conversation. So anything counts as a source as long as you explain why you're using it in the essay, where you're using it. Another point here that deserves some explanation is this last pretty lengthy bullet point that has to do with a sources page or works cited page. We haven't touched MLA, and there's a reason I don't go as far in depth with the Modern Language Association as much as I used to, because we might be switching. ECC and maybe the SUNY system statewide across New York State might be moving away from MLA to APA, and since that's unknown, I'll touch on MLA for the last unit. I'll gently request that you follow basic MLA formatting, but I'm not worried about that for this essay. So as long as you just have a list at the end of your essay of all the places you got your information, let's say it was one Wikipedia article and one YouTube video, as long as those are listed somehow at the end in a way that makes it obvious that you're letting me know where you got somebody else's information. Again, I didn't put a top end on how many sources you might use, so you might use a lot of sources briefly. Make sure you mention all of them, even if it's a quick quote that you mention from one philosopher. It's the only time that quote occurs in the essay. It would go on the list. So you're kind of doing a soft version of MLA. Same thing with in-text citation. I don't need the official parenthetical in-text citation format. If you know what that is, great. Use it if you're familiar with it. If you're familiar with APA, because you're a nursing student, you might be going in that direction. That's totally fine as well. But you can also do what I call the conversational style citation. That just means you literally mention the source. When I researched Eastern philosophy in Rolling Stone magazine, it had an article about how the Beatles suddenly went through a second wave of Eastern mystical philosophy that they built into their music, and that's when it really got pretty weird and pretty psychedelic. So as long as you're mentioning the source, I know where a quote came from, you're in the clear. Basically, you're just asking the question, if I use a quote or I'm citing a source, would it be obvious to the reader where that quote came from or what that source is? And you can do all of that through the language, just describing your research process. So normally I'm not a huge stickler for headings and formatting. I don't need a really official front page where you've left justified the name and the date exactly right. I usually don't care too much about that as long as there's a title that's an original title to kind of let me know where your paper's going. But for this paper, I'm going to make it grade contingent. In other words, you lose points if you don't do this. That you have a heading that in particular declares a first-person voice, a first-person declaration. So here's what I mean by that. I'm hoping for a variety of tones for these essays. I don't want these essays to sound the same. I want some of your personality to shine through. You may take on a very serious topic like the Civil War and whether or not it was essentially initiated by slavery or the War of Northern Aggression and the economic issues faced by the South. If you were to take on a serious topic like that, your tone should be serious. It should be kind of earnest. It should be something more sincere. So in your first person tone declaration, you'd say something like sincere and a little angry, or sincere and hostile. But you might take on a much lighter topic. You might take on an element of philosophy, like whether or not we're in a simulation right now. Can you prove that we're not in the Matrix this very moment? Can you prove that you're not in some alien's computer program? A lot of philosophers say that you cannot prove that, and you may deliberately take a lighter tone. You might deliberately say exploratory and optimistic, or exploratory and sarcastic. So in other words, I want you to make a conscious decision about the tone of the paper, how you're going to have an emotional through line, and it doesn't matter as long as you're consistent. So you declare the tone. I want this to be angry and hostile, and you keep that through the essay. Excellent. If you want it to be kind of light and frothy and kind of bubbly, excellent, as long as you carry that through and it kind of helps reinforce your message. Try to avoid dead neutral. I'm also requiring that this is a first-person essay. Partly, that's because as you get into more advanced writing courses, you're going to be increasingly demanded to use your own perspective. So using the first person is actually full cycle. Don't use first person in high school because you want to sound like everybody else. Now that we're in college, you're actually experimenting with your own first person voice and perspective. And if you go as far as graduate school, you want to get your PhD in advanced postmodern studies, God help you if you do, then you are going to in fact be using this very high level, nuanced, sophisticated first person voice where teachers will be actively looking for you to come up with thoughts that nobody else has come up with, your own twist, your own perspective. So first person voice for sure, and think about your own personality. What's more comfortable? Would I rather write an essay that's a little bit light, a little funny, a little jokey here and there? Would you like some sarcasm? You want it to be have a little bit more of a bite to it, or would you rather just make it very serious, bordering on angry and hostile because you're writing about something very serious? So give your essay a personality, decide what it is ahead of time, and it will be part of your grade that you actually go through the motions of declaring the feel, the emotional voice of your essay. That is part of the grade. These two sections also have a compliance element built into them, like I'm deliberately opening a Word document that you submitted through the Dropbox and Blackboard, and I can immediately see, yes, clearly this person had the directions next to them because they not only followed the formatting directions, they also have a heading that's appropriate that has that tone voice declaration, and they have things like a section that is specifically labeled as your Steelman section. This can be as short as one paragraph, but again, I'm forcing you to declare it, partly as the compliance test, but also this is you kind of committing to the bit. You've actually said to yourself, I think I'm Steelmanning here. And again, the definition of Steelmanning just means genuinely trying to create the alternate argument in a good faith way. So you're reproducing some of the main points of the other side, but you're doing it neutral, you're doing it in good faith at this stage, hoping that by laying out the best version of your opponent's argument, when you start tearing down their argument, you can do so more effectively. You're actually arguing against the points that they're making, as opposed to just casting spurious insults or insulting the personality of the person who made this statement. So Steelmanning will be a required heading, at least one paragraph, but you could also pepper that in throughout the essay and label it so that I know you read the directions. One last kind of compliance test that I'm baking into the essay which is the Will We Ever Learn section. I think in the syllabus, this essay is still actually called the Will We Ever Learn essay, because I used to teach a version of this course that was mostly history. Like, it was basically history all the way through. There was no literature, there was no philosophy, there was no fun musical discussions. So it was a course that was basically only about writing about history. So of course one of the essays had to be the Will We Ever Learn? You're probably familiar with some version or some bastardization of the quote of those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. I don't know if that quote is apocryphal or not, but it's catchy, so I like it, and it's a worthwhile thought experiment. So in your essay, particularly if you're dealing with history, but also if you're dealing with philosophy, you're looking for at least one paragraph of application, maybe in your own daily life or in our current political situation, in our current societal sense of unrest and unease. Is there some lessons to be gleaned? So at least one section called Will We Ever Learn? Actually label it so it's obvious that, again, that you read the directions. But what I'm looking for there is, can you map on any of the concepts that you're trying to learn and research and explore to our current situation, either for you individually or for us as a nation or for us as a global community. I already mentioned that first person is mandatory, and just make sure that you decide ahead of time how you want the essay to feel in terms of tone. It must be said here that we've already had 2 plagiarism flags and at least 1 confirmed plagiarism case where somebody copied and pasted more than half of their essay without any attribution, pretending that what they wrote was their own as opposed to something they pilfered from papers101.com or Bartleby. So don't do that for sure. And another reason I encourage the first person perspective while you're using I in the essay, you're taking some ownership. This is actually an opinion that I have, and frankly it's harder to plagiarize those papers. So make sure you're using first person perspective and you're actually arguing what you guess might be true in terms of whatever controversy you want to talk about. This is a vocab term. It's called paradox. This deserves its own 1-hour lesson. I'll probably never get it, but I certainly want to deal with it for at least a few minutes in a comprehensive vocab video. For now, paradox means contradiction. So if that's the only thing you remember for the quiz, is a paradox is a contradictory statement or a set of contradictory facts. And I actually want to use one example that I gave from the essay Possible Topics, and I'm just going to skip right to it. Democracy versus capitalism, and let me step away and get a visual aid. Okay, I know I said this was going to be a visual aid, but I want to try an auditory test on you first. I want you to listen to a sound that I'm about to make, and I want you just to think about how long it takes you to figure out what this sound is, okay? So I'm going to play the sound, and you just ask yourself, do you know what that sound is, and how long does it take you to figure it out? Here it goes. Got it? So those of you in the food service industry, if you work for tips, not only do you know what a stack of ones like this looks like, you're probably good enough and nuanced enough to know, based on the thickness, the density, the size, and the weight, this is about $92 in single $1 bills. If your brain is already that wired to recognize not just the sound, but kind of the weight and the feel and the texture of the hustle, that means you have one specific conception of capitalism. In other words, you're used to thinking of capitalism as someone who's hungry, as someone who really needs to work hard for those single dollar bills. When I waited tables for a couple years, I would work something like 14 hours a day for 3 days in a week, and I would be able to pull this many, a shoebox worth of single dollar bills. This one came from playing a lot of Frank Sinatra for little old ladies. It's basically musical prostitution. Oh, here you go, Sonny. Oh, that was nice. Fly Me to the Moon again. Either way, we both are aware of the idea of wanting to be hungry for money and wanting to get ahead. And that's one conception of capitalism. So if you think of capitalism by definition as it's every man for himself, You know, you got to get his head where you can. You got to hustle. You got to work. You got to find corners to cut where possible. The reason I'm bringing that up while I'm talking about the notion of a paradox is, have you ever looked at a quarter and seen the Latin that's written on a quarter? Because what I'm basically saying is the dollar symbolically represents the hustle, represents that need to get ahead, every man for himself. It will be about how successful you are, will be about whether or not you are able to use your own resources, your own skills, and your own willingness to work hard to get ahead, right? To get as far as you can in the world. But if you look closely at a quarter, here's what you see in Latin. Nothing to worry about with the Knights Templar, nothing to worry about the Illuminati. On the quarter, at least, you get something nice and feel good. It's e pluribus unum, and if you haven't looked that up, pull a quarter out of your pocket right now, just so you know that it's there. Essentially, what that is translated to from the original Latin is we many as one. Take a moment to think about that. Capitalism is every man for himself, and democracy is we're all in this together. Those two things don't naturally go together. There's a tension there. They're both true, but they are somewhat paradoxical. There is a feeling of tension. There is a conflict built within that. Simultaneously, my country is telling me to do the hard scrabble, to make sure you put your time in, to clock your hours and get your cheddar. But at the same time, my country is also telling me, and we're all in this together, and we have to help each other. We're all one nation under God. We're a melting pot, and as one single community, we should help raise each other up. Those two messages are in conflict with each other. They're both true. They're both part of what it means to be American. So that's why I wanted to use that specific example for now. For paradox. So that would be one way you could approach your paper, is thinking about those two separate philosophies. They are philosophies which exist in America. They exist together. They're both true, but there's tension there. And you could decide for yourself if you feel more strongly about one philosophy over another philosophy. The first philosophy, of course, being capitalism. The idea of financial wealth as status and identity is one way that you could approach life philosophically, but you could also think of patriotism, the new nationalism, the idea that as an American citizen, it should be all of us in this together first before you get to the competition. So that's a natural antagonistic relationship. It is in conflict. So I would describe America by definition as paradoxical. America has a paradox built into it. It is simultaneously every man for himself, get as far as you can and scrape it out, and we're all in this together, and we should help each other and make the world a better place. So those two ideas are both built into the founding documents of the American Constitution and Declaration of Independence, and there is some tension there to work through. So that was a roundabout way to say that there are going to be contradictions as you do your research. If you pick a good topic, you may see the same person contradict themselves. Emerson did that all the time, and he kind of bragged about it. Well, if I contradict myself, then I contradict myself. That's a paradoxical statement. We'll come back to that. I'll give you more examples. It's a pretty heady statement. But for now, when I say something like, look for the paradox, try to embrace that, realize that something as simple as America simultaneously as a democracy and a capitalist nation even a thing? Is that even possible, since it seems like those two things are at odds? I'm not going to go through all of these sample topics, but they're all similar in that they have two sides. They have historical arguments that are being played out over time, and they're not fully resolved. Some of them have a pretty obvious majority, where like a majority of people may agree that the pyramids were built by humans, and as it stands right now, a majority of historians believe that the pyramids were built by kind of a middle-class, unionized group of people that were into it. They enjoyed building the pyramids. It was like a 1950s union job, good wages, you enjoyed what you did, you were able to make enough to support your family, as opposed to slave labor, which was the other side of that argument for a very long time. You can decide if you want to bring aliens into the fray or not. Deliberately embedding a cultural history of the prohibition of marijuana, because that's probably a pretty clear-cut case of revisionist history. There was what people thought at one period that it just assumed was true about why marijuana was illegal, and some people probably deliberately went back and rewrote the history in a way to change the narrative. So feel free to take that one on. Another, I don't want to say popular topic, but a topic that clearly has two sides would be pick any war and try to argue for its necessity, or whether it was just bureaucratic, or one side's self-interest versus another side's self-interest. So I've gotten a lot of essays on the Vietnam War, as you can imagine. That's still hotly debated as to whether or not we were convincingly limiting the spread of communism by invading, or whether or not that, again, it was just self-interest in the military-industrial complex playing itself out. Feel free to do that with the Iraq War post 9/11. Feel free to go back to World War II, which brings me to the topic that I wrote about when I wrote this essay in college. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I have no idea whether or not that's a name that you're familiar with, or if high school deals with him the way they dealt with him in my day. They kind of skipped over FDR when I went to high school. They just kind of glossed right past him. And I will declare him, this is me selfishly expressing my own opinion, as my favorite president that ever was, because he got us out of the Great Depression, won World War II on the Western Front, ended Prohibition so that I can get a beer on Friday night instead of having it be illegal. So I'd rate him as a pretty decent president overall. But some people make the argument that he was the beginning of expansion of executive powers. In other words, he kind of set the pattern in the 20th century of each president kind of getting away with a little bit more than the previous president in terms of executive overreach. That's a totally worthwhile debate to have with two obvious sides. If you want a fun freebie, just go to YouTube, look up the words crash course and the Mongols, or the Mongols were the exception, either of those phrases, and you will get some pretty light but pretty delightful historical analysis of a people that were ruthless and savage, and yet they were good-natured and hilarious and sweet to their elderly and to their women. Kind of a mixed bag. They are paradox incarnate, in other words. They're the embodiment of paradox. So check out the Mongols if you want kind of a fun, completely different approach towards similar topics. I've gotten this essay a lot too. Some of you feel weirdly strongly about Tesla versus Edison, and to what extent Tesla had his ideas exploited and monopolized and stolen by Edison. I find that fascinating. It brings in a bunch of other social issues, so feel free to take that on as a topic if you're interested. So of course I have to acknowledge that I'm me. I grew up in America and had an American education. That does not mean you have to be American-centric in any way, and I would say it's probably true that you have an advantage if you're actually coming from somewhere else. So if you're coming here to study from overseas, if you and your parents immigrated here 10 years ago, but you still have a pretty active memory of your home country, your home culture, or some sense of your own origins, that can be really great because you'll know more than I would. You'll know more about your own history or your own culture's philosophy, and that can really give you an advantage because you can do some compare-contrast that will be way more expert and way more nuanced. So just as one example, let's say you're from Iran, so you're Iranian born, but you emigrated to the United States, or you're studying here from Iran and you're planning on going back. If you know anything about Iran, like pre-1970s, before the Ayatollah Khomeini came on the scene, Iran was a completely different scene, and you could talk about Persia, Persian culture, Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism.
Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism.
I think it's something like that. Whatever it is, it's a religion and a philosophy. It's fascinating. I know very little about it, except that I'd like to learn more. So if you have your own perspective or your own background, you want to use that as a foundation for the essay, makes it more interesting for me, gets you more points for specificity, and you'll probably just enjoy talking about it more and setting up some kind of a compare-contrast situation. If you're more philosophically minded, feel free to take the essay in that direction. I want to go through each of these in gruesome detail, because I could teach at least one and probably several lessons on each of these because I love these topics. But I'll let you look them up on your own, or maybe you're taking a philosophy course right now and these sound familiar. Feel free to borrow from other courses and kind of cross-pollinate. I do just want to spend a little time on the Tao of Pu, Western versus Eastern religious traditions. Here is a hint about the homework. If you haven't done homeworks, I believe it's 13 and 14. So Ralph Waldo Emerson talking about self-reliance, the importance of being your own person, the importance of maintaining a sense of self against conformity. That's in natural opposition to somebody like Alan Watts, who is very much more about the human race generally, and maybe the self isn't as important as we think it is. He goes as far as to argue that there may not even be a self. The you that thinks it's you doesn't even really exist in the first place. And here's a spoiler alert. Essentially, I'm just introducing you to East versus West. So if you did the homework and you got some traction, you could think of that as an example paper. Ralph Waldo Emerson is expressing a strong interest in the self. It's right there in the title. The self is the most important thing and the thing you should maintain most. Sounds more like capitalism to me. And Alan Watts, on the other hand, is espousing some variations on some general Eastern traditions that have to do with an emphasis on community, an emphasis on communal spirituality, and that sounds a lot more like e pluribus unum and the notion of democracy. So as one example, Ralph Waldo Emerson might be more interested in making sure you get ahead as an individual in America through your own resources, whereas Alan Watts is more likely to emphasize the community and the responsibility we have to help each other because our own selfish needs aren't the main priority. Classic paradox, classic kind of clashing of heads, and that would be one way you could write the essay. You've got some YouTube videos from Alan Watts, you got an excerpt from Self-Reliance. That would be enough to write the entire essay as long as you're trying to dig into these ideas with some detail and some examples. Okay, one last Hail Mary set of suggestions. If you specifically want to go for the philosophical paper, a lot of movies and TV shows deliberately try to flirt with some pretty heavy philosophical topics. So the famous one is The Matrix, if you're still aware of that movie, which I think was 99, 22 years old. That movie's old enough to drink. Or more recently, if you are aware of the John Wick movies, the Westworld TV show, Game of Thrones even deliberately kind of flirts with some philosophical issues. It would be pretty easy to start with the movie first and then try to have a conversation about a philosophical paradox that grows out of that. I didn't put it here, but frankly, Doctor Who, I'm not crazy about Doctor Who, but I know like at least 8% of you are borderline religiously obsessed with the TV show Doctor Who, which has been around for like 50 years. That's all it does. The whole point of that show, and to some extent Star Trek, and I'll go as far as to say Star Wars, all 9 incarnations, are deliberately trying to bring in some philosophical concepts or some philosophical conflicts. And if you can use that as an easy starting off point, and you look up 1 or 2 other additional articles, you get to talk about the movie, you get to talk about the philosophical issue at hand, and you get to also deliberately bring in some outside resources that might help deepen your own argument. So as we get close to the end, finally rounding things out, just keep it in mind that the setup is basically pretty simple. All you have to do is pick an argument, pick one side of the argument that you agree with. Once you've laid out both sides, make your case and explain why you think one side of that argument is right, whether it's in history or philosophy. The challenge of the essay is that could be about so many different topics. You're going to be overwhelmed. That's one of the reasons I wanted to introduce movies as an easy entry point. If you really liked the movie John Wick, but you feel weird about the fact that a movie basically makes it okay to be a serial killer because the main character's dog is killed at the beginning, John Wick then has a moral free pass for the entire movie to mow down as many bad people. Same thing with the Taken movies with Liam Neeson, if you're familiar. So you take a simple concept, something that's accessible in a movie, but then you can try to build on that and expand on that. Finally, that gets us to the important dates, so make sure you're aware of these. November 10th through the 11th, I'm going to make it so that the morning of the 10th, that'll be like 12:01 a.m., the quiz will go online. It'll have terms like paradox. It'll have some other related terms that I'll go through in more gruesome detail. And you want to make sure you're comfortable with those terms by November 10th. Gets us to November 12th. Extra credit attached to the essay. If I get the essay by then, please send me drafts in advance. A few of you already know to do that. It's like autopilot. You're getting extra check-in credit. You're also figuring out what the grade is in advance, and you're sleeping better at night because you're not anxious about the essay before you hand it in. But the final guillotine drop will be on November 14th, 11:59 of that night. So make sure I get whatever you consider your most final, most polished draft of the Controversies in History or Controversies in Philosophy lesson. All right, that took longer than I expected it to, which is the entire semester for me, and I'm guessing for you also. Reach out with questions, email me, let me know if I can clarify anything in regards to this essay. I'm grading it gently on content, but I will be looking for that formatting to be pretty buttoned up to make sure you're meeting the compliance tests. You know, you read the directions, you know enough to actually go through and double check that you've met all the specific criteria. So feel free to show me work in advance. That's it. Email with questions. I'll try to put another one of these out within the next week that is a comprehensive vocab roundup. So even if there's no more videos between now and the quiz, the next video should be kind of your study guide. All the terms lined up next to each other with at least one definition and at least one sample question. So tune in for that when it comes out, hopefully within the next week. Otherwise, see you guys next round.